Hey, what's up, everyone? So, from time to time, I will talk about RPG mags that relate to the EU. And I realize I haven't often done a good job of explaining what I mean by that, because I'm not talking about official Star Wars magazines like Star Wars Insider, or Star Wars Gamer, or Star Wars Galaxy. I'm talking about third party role playing game magazines, and there are a ton of those. There have been for decades that aren't about Star Wars, they're just about maybe gaming in general that nonetheless, in various cases, contain Star Wars role-playing game scenarios, stories, and various sources. Um, Officially speaking, many of the Star Wars EU ideas in these magazines are of an ambiguous canonicity, so that even during sort of the EU era prior prior to 2014, sort of the official line was, in a number of cases, they're officially part of the EU canon. They were officially licensed. In other cases, it's a bit more ambiguous for a variety of reasons. Maybe some of the stories and some of the magazines were, but not others. In some cases, I think they've flat out said, no, these aren't necessarily canon. But a lot of that comes down to just whether or not they have a record of the license actually being granted to publish these stories, right? What's so funny about this is that a lot of this sort of thinking came down not that long ago, really sort of like post 2000, when like Leland Shee, the keeper of the holocron, came to try and organize a lot of the licenses and try and put together a database of all the things in the EU to make sure that they were really keeping track of continuity so that they weren't creating any contradictions, so that they could sort of retcon and fix things that they were finding from the past. But the trick is, if you're an older EU fan, a lot of this stuff was EU to you. It didn't necessarily matter whether or not Lucasfilm kept good records of the licenses it granted in 1987 to a role-playing game magazine to publish a scenario. If you're accepting that magazine at the time, reading about it, seeing that Star Wars logo as part of that article, and you're seeing things that fit within your Star Wars continuity, you don't need Leland Shee 15 years later to tell you whether it was or wasn't officially licensed. It's part of the EU, sort of storyline, right? So again, I know that's kind of a slippery slope. I'm not trying to get into headcanon and simply make the argument that if something fits, it's therefore part of the EU. But I think it's worth opening up our mind a bit to the fact that there were things that, although Lucasfilm doesn't have great records of anymore, were at least at the time nonetheless sort of part of the continued expansion of the Star Wars sort of saga. So just to give you an example of a couple of the types of magazines I'm talking about, I have just a really tiny representative sample here. Like, here's a magazine in Phobia, right? Great magazine, thick magazine. This was from, this example was from, I forget. It's number 53. It's from, I don't know, a decade and a half ago or so. Tons of different articles on like Magic the Gathering, Wizards of the Coast stuff. Has a short sort of, Wizards of the Coast era Star Wars game scenario. This is the second issue of Adventures Unlimited, which was another role-playing game magazine. This had things like, trying to think what were some of the other stories in here. A lot of sort of role-playing games you might probably not have heard of, right? But one of them was Star Wars. You can see that there, and you can see on the cover someone who looks kind of like an old Jedi with a yellow lightsaber. Why is that? Well, there is a role-playing game scenario in here that fits within the EU. Polyhedron. This is one of the more major role-playing game magazines. This had a lot of Star Wars stuff in it from time to time. This is issue 100. This is a really fun one to get. Kind of a harder one to get just because it was sort of an anniversary issue. Here's another example too. This is sort of a fun one from Britain. This is kind of harder to find as well. Games Master. And just to give you an example of what I'm talking about when I talk about the type of EU Star Wars content inside, here's the article. It's only 2 pages. But check it out. It actually is introducing an entire new alien species to Star Wars. Now, in theory, what you're supposed to do is take these stats. This is from February 1990. Take the stats, take the ideas, take the characteristics of this new character, which they've given an image to, they've given a name to, and a background lore of the species, whatever. Take that, incorporate that into your West End game role-playing. When you're playing with your Star Wars role-playing books and scenarios, right, with your other gaming friends, right, you've got a new character now to use. So was that officially licensed or not in 1990? Well, 1990 was the dark times for Star Wars, right, and for Lucasfilm licensing. It's like, I think they probably did, but even if they didn't, I can tell you one thing, that just based on that story alone, whoever wrote it clearly took care to make sure that this was a species that fit sort of just comfortably, had the feel of Star Wars, that wasn't doing anything outright contradicting something in the EU. In other words, they didn't, accidentally draw the picture of a Bothan and tell you it was some new species, right? This is a new species that someone drew to be distinct from all the others, gave them a name that has not already been used, and described them in ways and allowed them to fit within the EU continuity that they themselves were sort of like partaking in, right? That in a way that just makes it feel like, regardless of whatever Leland Shee can tell you about what was licensed and what licensed paperwork they still have at Lucasfilm's headquarters, it just in a way that makes you realize, no, it actually is part of the EU, right? And the thing is, particularly when it comes to that dark times, the period, before sort of the re-flourishing of the EU with like the Thrawn trilogy and Dark Empire comics, and then, the rest is history, right? The thing is, if you're old enough, if you remember getting these magazines as a kid, largely because they had Star Wars stories in them that were, again, written by people like you, who, although a little bit older, right, were themselves playing these games, loved Star Wars, loved the EU, and wanted to help expand it, right, in consistent, in continuity sort of ways, right? Regardless of the license, this stuff sort of fit. Now, here's the thing, right? And my point is, I don't need Leland Shee, 15 years later to tell me one way or another whether or not it was part of my Star Wars, because I'm telling you, I was there at the time, and frankly, so was he. You know what I mean? Like, he probably read this stuff too. So the question is, given that ambiguity, does it fit or doesn't? It does. Therefore, I think it's kind of part of the EU, right? And why it's worth actually tracking these things down if you really want every little glimpse of EU that actually exists out there in the world about our precious, sort of Star Wars Expanded Universe canon. So it's tough. It's hard to think about, because what I don't want to argue is that just because something fits, that makes it part of the EU, right? Because you can make really weird arguments that like, hey, this new canon book or this new canon movie, well, I can find a way to make this fit. Well, we can't go that far, right? Because this is a case where we get to say, well, no, like the licensing is pretty clear, right? Lucasfilm has said this new stuff is not part of the old stuff, right? So there's a pretty clear line there, right? See, it's kind of hard to mix canon in that way. The question is, to some extent, it's like, where does this fall on the spectrum, right? Okay, even if, say, some of the stories like the one in, Games Master, right, was produced sort of under like kind of iffy licensing, maybe it wasn't even produced on a license, right? The question is, does that make it then like fan fiction? It's certainly a little bit more elevated than fan fiction, right? Like, this is not a fanzine. This isn't like on a blog, right? Like the way it would be published today or something. It's an official gaming magazine, an official, reputable, reliable, notable gaming magazine, right? In which this stuff's appearing, right? Moreover, by people who aren't just writing willy-nilly Star Wars stories, right? They're writing stories and providing sources and source material and RPG scenarios to actually fit with the in-continuity role-playing game, that like existed for the EU at the time, right? So again, on a spectrum, there's something about it that like gets you closer to sort of the EU than at least just something that any one of us could randomly make up, right? So again, I think for those reasons, they're worth tracking down. And I think the other thing that gives them a certain sort of like edge of credibility is that there are a number, like the Polyhedron, right? Like the one I showed, Polyhedron number 100. A lot of those magazines are actually officially part of the EU continuity. Things that like Chi and others did come in to say, yep, it was licensed in this way. Yes, it fits in this way. Yes, it's C canon. It fits, right? So it's like these types of magazines, at least, many of them, right, officially have this sort of status. And I think it's not that hard to then kind of extend just a little bit further to some of the more ambiguous ones, right? And the list goes on and on. It's not just Games Master, Polyhedron, and Phobia. It's things like White Wolf Magazine, Troll Magazine, Dungeon Magazine. I mean, Dragon Magazine, the list of titles goes on and on. There's like 150 titles alone that I can think of, any number of which have multiple issues, right? Some are super obscure. Some are from outside North America. There's French ones. There's Spanish ones. Some of them are really hard to track down. A lot of them, fortunately, are available digitally. A lot of them can be found online. There are scans of them and stuff like that. But it's not impossible to find them physically. You're going to pay a pretty penny for some, a very pretty penny for a few. But again, if you're a completist, it's worth actually thinking through. Admittedly, some of these are legitimately just background sort of scenarios. They're just things that say, okay, imagine in the context of the West End games, you're a rebel intelligence officer and you need to get from point A to point B. Here are some stats. Here's what to do if you roll the dice at this number, right? So frankly, in terms of its contribution to EU lore, you'd be hard pressed to say that even though it's part of the EU, right? Like, does it really provide any new sort of story ideas? Well, no, not really, right? That said, say take something like the Games Master. You're learning about a whole new species, right? So although you don't need to read it to know more about how the EU worked, if you want to know everything about the EU, you need to know that, for instance, that species exists, right? And that's a magazine that does it. You're not really going to find that stuff anywhere else. Kind of in a cool way, though, there are some things from these magazines that appear for the first time that actually do get incorporated into some of the other books, right? So although you might never see that species outside of your own role-playing games, even though it's part of the EU, there are some characters, like even some Jedi characters that were introduced, like I'm thinking of the magazine Masters of Role-Playing 8, which introduces, I forget the name of it now, is it Jedi Bear or something? But introduces a Jedi character who then you see in the books. And you're like, that is really, really cool. So again, on a spectrum, this stuff goes from totally official to sort of like kind of quasi-official, but right down to actually being sourced and used by other EU authors themselves, right? Just sort of proving just how sort of kind of in the EU zone this stuff really was. And again, really exciting to pick up. I will be doing a lot more about this stuff in the future, but I want to kind of just whet people's appetite for this kind of strange new world of RPG third-party magazines, right? Because again, just when you think you've got it all, you've seen it all, you've got all the books, all the movies, all the role-playing games, whatever, right? You've seen all the TV shows. Have you really seen it all, right? And, you know, again, unless you've seen Games Master, you know, from February 91 or whatever, right? You're really only scratching the surface. And it's pretty exciting. The EU truly is unlimited.